This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hello and welcome to this event for the Asia Business Event Series. My name is Hamish Curry, Executive Director at the Asia Education Foundation at Asialink, and I'll be your host today for this exciting discussion on tapping into international education. Before we begin, I would like to give an acknowledgement of country and to the traditional owners for the lands on which we meet today, particularly the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation across the city of Sydney. We pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their elders, past, present and emerging, and those who are with us today. Before we get into our event and some of our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So this session is being recorded, which means that you will be able to watch this at a later time. Those of us who are joining live, you have the opportunity to submit some of your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in this webinar. And we will do our best to field some of those questions, or certainly where our panelists can, to respond and provide some of the further resources for you. Today, we're going to be talking our way through how we tap into international education in these challenging times, and particularly hearing from a range of people. We're going to be hearing from Councillor Robert Koch from the City of Sydney first, who will give us a 10-minute keynote talk about his current work and what he sees in this current landscape. Then we'll be deferring to our three panellists, which I will introduce shortly. Of course, today's event is about looking at not just this context for what is happening outside Australia for international students, but also what is happening here, onshore and domestically, right across Sydney. And that's where today we want to balance this discussion and get a whole lot of different examples, as well as perspectives on how do we address this? How do we move? How do we start to change our thoughts, our ideas, and our strategies on what we can do to tap into international education? And we've got a really great lineup of people here speaking. Very shortly, I'll invite Councillor Robert Koch to speak, but let me tell you first a little bit about him. Councillor Robert Koch is a practicing lawyer by profession. Robert is the Deputy Chair of the Culture and Community Committee and the Economic Development and Business Subcommittee for the City of Sydney. Robert was first elected to the council back in 2008, so he's been doing this for quite some time, which is fantastic. He's known for his strong understanding of Asian culture, as well as the city's diverse Asian communities. He's, of course, very passionate as an advocate for cross-cultural awareness. And Robert is particularly interested in international relations, cultural exchange, business innovation, education, and urban planning. Robert is also an alumni of Macquarie University and Bond University, as well as through his work at Asialink, and he's also a governor of the WWF Australia. We'll then be passing to Peter Mackie, who's Director, Education Trade, New South Wales Treasury. Peter Mackie joined the New South Wales Government in 2014 after 7 years with Austrade. Peter was posted as Trade Commissioner to Hanoi in 2010 and later to Singapore. During this time, he also held a regional role as Education Commissioner for ASEAN, leading Austrade's regional education team across Southeast Asia. In his current role, Peter oversees the New South Wales Government's international education strategy through Study New South Wales. Next, we followed up with Swan Yeo, Head of Education of Australia and New Zealand for Google. Swan is the Head of Education looking after all schools and universities in the Australia and New Zealand region. Having lived and worked in six different countries and across 4 product teams over 18 years at Google, he's finally settled in sunny Sydney with his wife and 2 tweens. With a background in sales and managing high-performance teams, Swan is passionate about education technology and being a disruptor to the traditional classroom. After a whole year working from home, Swan is ready to get out and see the world. And finally, our fourth speaker this morning will be Shishi Trong, Director of Customer Success and Executive Director for New South Wales Practera. Practera is Australia's leading experiential learning edtech and programs provider. Shishi is a highly experienced leader, strategic stakeholder manager, relationship builder, and commercially minded across sales and business development. Shishi currently leads the end-to-end customer experience for Practira, as well as driving strategic relationships with some of Practira's long-term customers and accounts nationally and internationally. Shishi also sits on Practira's global management team, helping drive business strategy and making key business decisions alongside Practira's founders and co-CEOs. So I'm sure you can see that we've got a huge array of expertise and experience in the room today. But now, without further ado, I would like to invite Councillor Robert Koch to join our session. And now, Councillor, I'm going to pass over to you to give us your first reflections and keynote on this issue. Over to you, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamish Curry. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Asia Business event for 2021. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of our land, and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the people of the 200 nationalities who live in our wonderfully diverse and multicultural city. We are indeed blessed and to have such a multicultural city. This is the first of a series of 3 events the city produces in partnership with Asialink business, with today's focus being on international education. Whatever difficulties there are at present with China, Asia as a whole remains critical to Australia's recovery from COVID pandemic. Today, you will hear about new opportunities in international education, both here and in Asia. Hear case studies of businesses that have successfully exploited opportunities to expand their business, and hear about free trade agreements that have come into force over the past 12 months. International education is a priority sector for the City of Sydney, and one which we can continue to support with a range of programs to welcome and engage with international students. The city has a significant population from all Asian countries. It is a welcoming and livable city with a deserved reputation for safety and amenity, as well as respected tertiary institutions, which we will come to make it a natural choice for many. Free trade agreements such as the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership and others also provide a range of opportunities for education businesses in Sydney to expand their operations offshore. So we hope that we can soon welcome students back to our city. But in the meantime, we hope this event will help you strengthen your business and look towards new opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, we are indeed blessed to have such a multicultural city. And I don't think anywhere else in the world you'll find a city where there is a Chinatown, Koreatown, and Thai town all within a cluster. And you know, it is the community, the people that make up this whole area. And the opportunities abound, you know, in Asia, and me being an Asian Australian and having my education here as well earlier, much earlier, you know, I found that the education sector in Australia, the quality of education, and also most importantly, the whole experience here in Sydney gives an all-around education to the potential students. So you know, I encourage many of you to take advantage of this and what we as a city has to offer in terms of looking after our students, in terms of the amenities, also in terms of what the community has built in Asia Town, in Chinatown, Koreatown, and Thai Town. So this is an opportunity here as well for you to ask questions of the presenters, and also to leave with tools and resources to support your work. So I would ask you all to please respond to the post-event survey, which will help us better understand your needs and how to continue supporting you. So I look forward to this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Robert Koch, for those remarks. I think it goes to the heart of being able to take very much a community approach, which is something that the councillor has definitely highlighted there as one of his key passions and areas of interest. And we know that at this time, supporting communities and looking at those joined up approaches is exactly why this event series has come together, and why we've brought so many great speakers today to try and look at how do we start to stitch up that joined up approach, particularly given the interests across the City of Sydney in trying to better support international education. And given this space of international education, it's certainly a great pleasure for me to now introduce Peter Mackey from Study New South Wales as someone who is well informed and highly experienced in this space. So Peter, tell us about what you've been up to and what you've noticed over this period.
Thanks very much, Hamish. Just checking you can hear me okay? Great. Look, thank you very much, Hamish. Thanks also to Asialink and to the City of Sydney. Robert, thank you for taking the time to make those opening remarks. This is a great opportunity to be able to connect with people at a really crucial time for this sector. I wanted to start firstly by noting the timing of today's session and just acknowledging the impact that the JobKeeper coming to a close is going to have on many of the SMEs that would be on the call today, and particularly I'm thinking of those vulnerable sectors, SMEs from those vulnerable sectors who are really have been particularly impacted by the closure of borders, especially those in the education sector that are exclusively internationally focused. So I think they're, specifically of the ELICOS sector, for example. Also think of other related sectors such as the purpose-built student accommodation sector that have been devastated. Not to mention all of those businesses and livelihoods that depend on international students. And I'm sure Robert is mindful of that when he thinks of all of the businesses across the Sydney basin. But look, we're very lucky here in New South Wales in that we have a very high level of political support for the international education sector. The Treasurer and the Premier, I'm sure many of you have seen some of the comments they've been making or heard some of the comments they've been making in the media. And they're very outspoken about the importance of this sector. We were very lucky to be able to secure a $20 million student welfare package at the height of COVID that supported students and in fact continues to support 6,000 students in crisis accommodation, also funds a package that we have with Food Bank rolling out tens of thousands of food packages. So really important to remember that whilst the sector's been devastated, we still have a very significant number of international students here in the state, and that continues to be our focus in terms of supporting them and hopefully through some of the insights you've got today, helping to support some of the businesses rebuild from here. Look, I don't want to overstate the economic impact of the international education sector because, we're very conscious of not, I suppose, looking at the sector purely in terms of the cash that international students generate. But I think, because there's obviously so much more benefits that international students bring to our education system, our communities, the future kind of bilateral relationships and international relationships. But really, I think the border closures has brought into sharp relief that broader link to the ecosystem that international students have throughout our economy, and so really mindful of the impact it's having on businesses around the broader Sydney basin and New South Wales more broadly. But our Treasurer, who has been quite vocal, as I said before, has said that obviously the priority remains to help supporting returning Australians, but he also feels that we have a responsibility to all those Australians whose livelihoods depend on this sector. And really, I guess one silver lining of this pandemic has been that I think from the state government's perspective, there's never been a more sophisticated understanding of this sector. So I think that definitely is a positive and it stands us in good stead. The other part of the timing that's interesting is yesterday we moved into the Department of Premier and Cabinet from New South Wales Treasury. So the Premier announced a couple of weeks ago the establishment of a new entity, Investment New South Wales. And this was really about having a one-stop shop that will position New South Wales as a world-leading destination, whether that be to global businesses or to tourists and students and so on. So quite significant that we come together at this time. And this also coincides with a doubling in size of our group. In fact, Study New South Wales doubling in size and resources as well from June. But also our international network offshore going to 55 in 20 locations with dedicated education people in markets, key markets including China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and also India and Latin America. So good timing in terms of rebuilding for the sector. The other thing I just wanted to highlight too is that Study New South Wales will shortly be releasing our revised international education strategy for the next 2 years. So more details about that coming up. Also, before I finish today, I wanted to give a bit of a plug for some grants that are available to the international education sector, particularly those businesses that have had to invest in rejigging and pivoting into different areas of delivery, including online delivery. So look, Hamish, just 3 points I wanted to cover off today because I know our opening remarks are just to be quite brief. The first point I wanted to make is that the model of onshore mobility will not disappear. We have heard a lot of comments coming out of Canberra and other places that institutions need to, just give up on this idea and move on. I just don't think that's the case. I think borders will reopen. We're making really good progress in that. And obviously that's the key focus for me at the moment in terms of developing the plan for New South Wales in terms of return of students. But, there's been a number of surveys, one recently that was published in the PI International Education News that was around, I think, looked at around 5,000 respondents a study. And that showed that they were increasingly positive of perceptions of countries, their perceptions of countries whose borders remained open during the pandemic were incredibly positive. And we've seen that in terms of students going to the UK despite the high levels of COVID infections and really that demonstrates that students are willing to change destinations in order to access face-to-face learning. So I think, part of that survey talked about the fact that students were prepared to study for maybe 3 to 6 months online before considering a move to other destinations if those borders were not open. So it's really crucial that we get our borders open so that we can signal to students that there is an opportunity to get back down here to Australia. But look, clearly we're losing market share as a result of that, and there's going to be a big lag and a big flow-on effect to the pipeline of students coming into Australia. And look, Robert touched on this. Certainly the uncertainty in some of our key bilateral relationships is going to have an effect, but I think the demand will remain incredibly strong globally. Australia's value proposition will remain really high. I think we offer a premium experience for students to be able to come down here and study, work and live in our country. And certainly that's not going to change, but it is going to take time to rebuild. I mentioned before, we've still got a very significant number of international students that are here. I think the most recent numbers were just under 60,000 students, higher education students, and around 50,000 students in the vet sector, 2,000 in our school sector, and around 1,600 in ELICOS still here onshore, with significant numbers of students remaining studying online offshore. So our responsibility through that student welfare package remains as high as ever, and that will continue to be strong. The second point I wanted to make, Hamish, is that whilst that onshore model will not disappear, it is going to change. And I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of that. Just been incredible how swiftly the education sector was able to shift to the online delivery, and the quality of the programs being delivered to international students is really quite amazing. I think there's a great opportunity for those businesses those providers who are based here in Sydney in particular, to strengthen their partnerships with our EdTech sector. So we have one of the country's largest ecosystems of education technology companies, just a stone's throw from down the road from where I am here at the Startup Hub, also down at the Haymarket HQ. We've got amazing opportunities to be able to connect in with businesses that have got great technology solutions. And I think our responsibility in growing those partnerships between our education providers, particularly the SME providers and our EdTech companies, is a really significant one. The other interesting thing has been to look at some of the large universities that had strong transnational delivery in terms of offshore campuses. I think of some of the Victorian ones, such as Monash, who've announced operating surpluses despite COVID. So, having that opportunity to deliver programs offshore has become even more important, or it's become clearer that it's more important than ever. So I think we're going to see a lot more partnerships that build that resilience, whether that be through the 2+2, where students might study online, or study at home and then come here later, or indeed start online and come later. We're seeing a lot of discussion around these offshore study hubs to try and build that bridge for students to be able to stay connected with their institution until they're able to come onshore. And I've seen a number of institutions already moving in that direction, and I think the Victorian government's already announced a significant investment in that regard. We're just looking into that at the moment and seeing, whether that's something that would be adding value or perhaps even duplicating what's already happening with institutions. I think there's definitely going to be the expectation for students to have opportunities to access online work, integrated learning opportunities as part of their studies, and it'll be interesting to hear from Shishi later on for Bacteria, and we've done a lot of programs in partnership with them. The other thing I just wanted to say that will change is, whilst we don't want to directly promote a migration outcome as a result of an education outcome, I think, there's no doubt that our skilled migration program across the country, and particularly here in New South Wales, has been devastated by closed borders. So I think there's a great opportunity to look at targeting particularly high degree research students in key fields to help with that skills gap and our innovation agenda moving forward. And look, the third thing I just wanted to cover off is that, as I mentioned before, transnational delivery and skills in the region remain, the shortage of skills gaps in the region remains, and it's probably never been more strong than it is now. In your introduction there, Hamish, you talked about the time that I spent up in the region. One of my key priority areas during that time was to try and find a sustainable model where there was the opportunity to be able to deliver skills in market, particularly in that vocational space. One of the big challenges there that I found when I was there was that there is a real gap between the viability of delivering those programs at low cost for Australian providers, but also the affordability in market. And one of the key areas that we found great success in was when you had a three-way relationship between business in the region that had the gaps for their that they had those major skills gaps that they needed to fill, but with an Australian provider that had fantastic opportunities to be able to, that had fantastic content, but also then the third part of that relationship was in-market providers that were able to deliver programs there in market. So one example I just wanted to highlight before I close in my opening remarks is an example that was brought to my attention by the ASEAN Focus Group that helped broker a deal between the Ramsay Sime Darby Healthcare College that is set to become part of the University of Wollongong, Malaysia, KDU, through an acquisition that University of Wollongong made a year or two back. So that transaction, which I believe remains subject to Malaysian government approval, will see University of Wollongong, Malaysia acquire 100% of that Ramsay Sime Darby Healthcare Education Services Group, and they'll be delivering their nursing and healthcare programs, including transferring appropriately trained staff through their, I think they've got around 300 to 400 current students offshore there. So that would really see, that acquisition would see that college's nursing and health services programs being jointly delivered, jointly branded between Ramsay Sime Darby, continuing to deliver their programs to eligible students with those partners from Australia. So I think that's just one example of a whole range of different potential partnership opportunities that are there. And I think, post the current situation we find ourselves in now, there's going to be an increasing push to try and build some of those types of examples, because they really are the sorts of models that really will help to make this sector more resilient and sustainable into the future. So I might pause there, Hamish, and pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for those opening remarks and a huge amount of detail that you've shared there, which is actually only reinforcing the potential and value of really great relationships, but also just highlights how interconnected so much of this work is, particularly when we start to look at the role that international students play and the role of that interrelationship between universities, providers, and other systems, and in fact, just how interconnected we can be in the solutions, of which you've highlighted a number of initiatives across New South Wales, particularly that new Investment New South Wales, which I think is fantastic, the grants, and the revision of the international education strategy. And I think you've captured actually a lot of the landscape really, really well. So thank you very much, Peter. Well, we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who, after spending 18 years at Google, you reckon, Swan, you pretty much got the Google chips well and truly plugged in. So I'm not going to say that you have all the answers that possibly Google has, but I know you've got some really great experiences and context for what you've seen happen over this last period, but also what you've seen happen over your career. So Swan, over to you.
Thanks, Hamish, and thank you, Asialink City of Sydney, for having me today. As Hamish kindly introduced, I get to work in a very interesting space in a very interesting time. My primary role is working with education organizations all around the world, but primarily around the use of technology. Now, here in Australia and New Zealand, what an interesting year we've just had. Right? When you think about the impact of COVID, obviously, on the education sector, it's been huge, right? We've got schools that were shut down, were closed, students forced into home, remote distance learning, and really sort of that impact that's had on the sector. I also get to work a lot with universities that have international students, obviously impacted by not being able to come back in. So overall, across the board, a huge impact, in terms of what we saw, the past 12 to 15 months, almost had on our economy here. You heard Peter talk a little bit about the impact on the industry. In my world, we get to work a lot with education technology organizations that provide some of these services to education organizations, and many of them, I think, have had to pivot, over the last 12 months to different hybrid learning models. So, obviously, face-to-face, sort of instructional teaching was no longer possible in many scenarios, and so many of them had to shift to the virtualized environments. And what that meant, right? How do you digitize all of that content and bring that online? How do you make it useful? How do you make it interesting content that can interact with the students when they are behind a screen? We're doing this on Zoom today. How many of us even knew of Zoom 2 years ago? I mean, it's phenomenal when we see sort of the opportunity that's ahead of us, right? With some of these new hybrid learning models. So that's the first one, virtual learning environments, hybrid learning models, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing I want to talk about, is the idea of future-proofing yourself, right? So whether you're an individual, whether you're a learner, or whether you're a education technology provider, how do you future-proof your company to provide these services to international students that are either overseas or even local students that are now learning, in a remote, capacity? So how do you future-proof yourself with the content? How do you make your content engaging with your audience, right? It's really, really important. You see, we talk a lot about using video content, using user-generated content, to really engage with the audience. And so, that component is so important. And that's what we're seeing, the rise of, applications, virtual reality, augmented reality applications, right? Finding new, innovative, engaging ways to interact with your audience is so important. And then the third area I'm going to talk about is certifications, right? So, we're seeing now with some of these hybrid learning models, one opportunity is how do we certify students, who, whether it's a short course or whether it's a 12-week course, with the right credentials, right, for attending a course. So I'm seeing a lot of short courses, sort of, even at our local case, right, sort of the non-nationally recognized courses. We're starting to see sort of an interest in some of these shorter courses because learners want to learn specific things, and that's what they'll be focusing on, right? They just want to learn, rather than sit through an entire term or semester. They just wanted to learn a specific thing. Now, how do we impart that knowledge? How do we facilitate that learning? And beyond that, right, how do we certify that the fact that they have learned that material? So 3 things: virtual learning, future-proofing, and certifications, which I think sort of where we see a lot of the education technology providers heading towards in terms of pivoting, sort of post-COVID. And beyond that, again, we know there are a lot of providers that are hurting, during this period. So, I love to work with them, with you directly, in many of these areas, on how we can better engage, your audience through the use of technology, in and outside of the classroom. So I'll leave it at that, because I know we have an exciting Q&A panel and looking forward to more discussions. So back to you, Hamish.
Thanks very much, Swan. As always, you give as good as you get in terms of those provocations and the opportunities. And I think that's probably what brings a lot of our attendees here today, which is looking for the opportunities. And I think what joins up your approaches there around both the new tools and models, the future proofing, and then the change of credentialing is diversification. And so the idea of being able to start to experiment with some different approaches. And I like to think in terms of even the work that we're doing, in hindsight, knowing what you know now, what do you wish you could have done differently? And if you take the same length of time now looking forward, what opportunities do you want to start to explore? Diversity can be a wonderful thing, but you can't spread yourself too thin, which I know is something that we're all very familiar with. But I think Swan has actually highlighted very good ways to frame that thinking. Particularly, I just pick up on your point there about future-proofing and the role of engagement, which I think is probably one of the key defining elements I think that we've all found through the digital space. How do we start to change the nature of engagement? So thank you very much, Swan. Well, of course, last but not least, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Shishi from New South Wales Practera. And of course, Shishi, when it comes to doing things differently and looking at the role of networks and how we reach people in different ways, you have got an absolute treasure trove of great experience. So tell us about what you've been up to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hamish. And again, like all the speakers have said so far, thanks so much, City of Sydney and Asialink Business for this opportunity to share. And so Hamish already provided a real quick sort of summary of who we are at Practera. And I just want to reiterate there that we're very much about experiential learning, and how experiential learning is, in our eyes, a piece of the solution when it comes to supporting students and professionals and learners to upskill and reskill as the nature of the workforce changes rather rapidly before our eyes. And we know that experiential learning is complex and costly to deliver, and therefore our platform comes into play when it comes to scaling up experiential learning as a solution here. We're very much, Practera, as Peter has mentioned, we're very much a Sydney-based SME that plays directly into the international ed space, not exclusively, but we do. And so really wanting to just share a little bit about sort of what we've done, what we've gone on, and I'm sure the Q&A will let me speak a little bit more to our journey today over the last 12 months in particular. So in terms of what we've been up to, I just thought I'd share a bit of a case example, and just being sort of, as I said, a Sydney-based SME in this space, what we've experienced and how we have supported universities and education providers during the current times, and we're very much a B2B business, so we're very much working with universities and other education providers when it comes to delivering impactful online will experiences, which again, Peter, you mentioned as one of the things we do. If I may, I'll just sort of start off with a case study. So we work with the University of Sydney Business School to deliver the Job Smart program. What the Job Smart program is a program for international postgrad business school students that acts as an employability accelerator for their students. And this is a large-scale program offered to all their postgrad students. So we're talking above 5,000 students annually. And the program provides students with awareness, helping them to build early career assets when it comes to employability, qualities and skills to lift their employability during their time in Australia and also as they return home. So the context, of course, when we came into 2020 was that obviously borders closed and that the program really needed to be reimagined and rethought in terms of what University of Sydney found themselves in, which is 50%, up to 50% of their cohort being offshore. And so we, as their long-term technology solutions provider to this program, really worked with the University of Sydney Business School to revamp the program, to really go online first, and then think about all the cascading things to be thought of to revamp and redesign the program. And the happy ending, I guess, and it's still going, the program, but at the end of 2020, JobSmart Edge, which is one phase of the JobSmart program, actually won the overall Global Education Award at the QS Reimagine Education Awards at the end of last year, beating over 1,500 applicants to effectively take out the top award. So that's a really great example. And I really wanted to share a few points around this very practical example of just tapping into the opportunities in Asia, and in particular, this was the predominant cohort being offshore in Asia during these times, and sort of what stood out about this case example that then led to that award win. And I'll give a few points from my point of view. So I think one, obviously the program being long running, so we've been delivering that program with the business school at USyd for over 5 years now. The program responded very quickly to the external environment change. We pivoted the program in this pandemic situation super quickly and really allowed students to equip them to step into an even more challenging job market. So that's one. It really evolved very quickly to the environment. The second one I think really highlights about this program is that the University of Sydney Business School wanted to do more during this time to support their students to deliver impactful and deeper employability experiences as they were either onshore or offshore, and that was led by one of the associate deans there. Also during this time, we upped the industry touch points. So there was a real emphasis on wanting to ensure that students during this time stepping into an uncertain sort of COVID employability market had more industry touch point, more industry engagement than the previous version of this JobSmart program. But also we made sure that there was equity of opportunity and equity of experience for those who are both onshore or offshore, because of course of old the program was delivered fully onshore. So I think those 4 points just in terms of practicals really stood out in terms of the award win for this particular program. Happy to delve into more in the Q&A. The other example I wanted to quickly speak to as well is, and with fellow panelists on today's call, I really want to acknowledge the support that we've received as a Sydney-based SME from mechanisms run by the City of Sydney and Study New South Wales, and in particular, the example I'll share today was seed funded by Study New South Wales via the partner projects mechanism, and that was the Global Trade Accelerator program that was got off the ground as a result of that funding. And so I just wanted to turn to this example as something slightly different, because this program was designed and conceptualized when pre-COVID, so international students were here, and that the program really allowed us, and we really thought about it as an opportunity to tap into the rich fabric of international students who are here. And of course, as we know, still a substantial are here still. And so the Global Trade Accelerator program is a real opportunity that teams students up with peers. And the idea is that these international student teams who have knowledge connections to their home countries would be able to help Australian exporters to complete an international market research report, hopefully value adding, to support these Australian exporters to tap into export opportunities abroad. And one of the things we found, of course, is that not only are these sort of cultural connections and knowledge of their local home markets valuable, but language then became a really key factor when it comes to online research and finding out export opportunities and reading websites, for example, in foreign languages. And so through that, the program, which has now been delivered to more than 1,000 students in New South Wales, having completed that, which represents about 200 teams that have gone through the program since November 2018, but also 200 plus international market research reports that have been delivered back into the hands of Australian exporters to look at export opportunities abroad. And so I just wanted to give that example because that taps into international students that are here, as opposed to my first example, where we've really supported the business school the USyd Business School to tap into and pivot in these times when they found up to 50% of their cohort offshore. Just a couple of other quick things I'll mention as well. So obviously during this time as a small business, we've had to pivot and learn and tap into opportunities to also continue to shore up our own business growth. And one of the different examples that I just want to quickly mention is we've recently partnered with the Education Centre of Australia, so ECA, and really partnering with them and bringing them on board as customers for them to tap into the Asian market and deliver using our platform and programs to a clientele and student base based in Asia. So we'll be doing digital industry projects with them a little bit later this year. And also this theme that we've mentioned today around partnerships. So we've started looking at, what partnerships can we form to continue to service the Asian market. And one of those partnerships that we've been discussing of late and acting on is with Austrian Shanghai and just the employer network that's represented there and what that means for students that complete our programs either here or offshore and tapping into an employer market that is perhaps favourable for their employability outcomes. So I might just leave it at that and hand back to you, Hamish, at this point, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Shishi. As always, I know that you can be relied on for cramming in a lot of great examples in such a short amount of time. Well done. I think what was really impressive about what you shared, which is when the pandemic really set in, I think most of us would have turned around and going, right, we're going to have to start to really shrink and sort of, refocus a couple of things. And it sounds like what you did was actually, you did the opposite. You actually dialed up the opportunities, and particularly your comment about the Job Smart Edge program, where you actually looked at more industry engagement rather than less, really looking for how do we help people network at this time when we are quite connected. And it does flow into, I think, a bit of a theme that we're hearing across the speakers today. And particularly great to hear also about that Global Trade Accelerator program, which very much sort of highlights the role of peer-to-peer learning, which we know is something that goes on. Sometimes it's invisible, and ways that we can make it more accessible. And particularly, I like your point there about the role of equity here, which I know is something that many of us do worry about, particularly when there is a time when others can feel like they're being left behind. How do we scale and design for more equity in these challenging times? So again, great to have your input, Shishi. I know you've got some other great case studies to share. Well, now it's time to bring back our speakers so we can get into some of the Q&A. But while they're getting back online, this is also the opportunity for some of our viewers to get into the Q&A function, which, as I mentioned, is down the bottom of your screen. So here is your opportunity to now come back with what are some of the big burning questions that you've got from what our speakers have shared, and how can you start to share those questions, as well as how can we start to respond to those. So please do jot in some of your questions to the Q&A. However, though, I do want to perhaps actually come back just to you, Peter, for a moment, because I need to sort of pick up on something that you mentioned to me, which is about the fact that this is a long game, and Australia has been in this for quite some time. What, in your opinion, has been the long-term impact of how we've invested in international students, and what have been the long-term gains and stories that you've heard?
Yeah, look, I think, Hamish, it's the thing that really often gets forgotten in this is it's almost impossible to put a value on if we get it right. If Australia gets this idea right, and obviously we don't have the 600,000 or whatever it is students we would normally have in the country right at the moment. But as I said before, I think that is going to come back, and we've still got a very significant number of international students. Around 80% of those students return home, and almost all of those students will end up being in well influential positions, whether that be in government, whether it be in industry, or whatever walk of life they go into. So I mean, every single one of those students is going to be a future potential influencer in their country, whether that be around an investment decision in Australia, whether it be around being buyers of our goods and services, whether it be as a future tourist, a future visitor, or indeed a future parent and thinking of where they're going to send their students, or they might be sitting around the the table on a negotiation at a bilateral level. And if we've got that right, it's almost impossible to put a value on the benefits that brings. One example I just wanted to share, I've been on about probably half a dozen trade missions with various trade commissioners, whether that be at the state or federal level, but more recently with our state ministers. And what always never fails to amaze me is that in 9 out of the 10 meetings that you'll have in a particular country, the minister will be sitting opposite a counterpart who has studied in Australia. And I think our ministers don't really quite understand that. And what I've found is in the region, students value so much that connection to Australia. And I think it's really something that we don't quite fully appreciate and don't fully capture. Again, not just purely from an economic perspective, but from a soft power perspective. So we're always amazed when we come home and the ministers are so delighted to have been able to have the opportunity, because it means you've got something in common. You can move beyond that immediate sort of connection to a much deeper level connection, because you know that there is that mutual understanding.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think it's an important story that this is very much something that creates that long tail. And sometimes we can't see it now, but the investment in that for all of us in the future is one that we know exists right across our networks, and particularly across our neighbours in the Asia Pacific. Swan, now just coming to you for a moment, I know that probably one of the most common questions you must get asked is, so how do we adapt? I mean, there's lots of things that we can do, and you've mentioned a couple of those. But particularly when it comes to some of, in your experience, what technologies can businesses deploy to better understand, perhaps their students that they're attracting, and also where they're coming from?
Thanks, Hamish. And I don't have all the answers, but I think the first question you can ask is to ask your students, is to ask your learners, how do you want to best engage with your educator, with your teacher? I think getting feedback is part of that journey, in terms of, because every student we know is different, and they learn in different ways. And so I think it's important for us to first acknowledge the fact that students do learn in different ways. So I think first step is asking. Beyond that, in terms of what we're seeing in the industry, in terms of technology trends, best practices, have been really around, using interactive mediums, to engage with students. So whether this is a combination of MOOCs and videos and I mentioned earlier online-based certifications, right, to strengthen the value of a particular course that someone's taking. I mentioned and touched on a little bit virtual reality and augmented reality. I mean, the rise of all these different applications that we see now, where learning can take place anywhere. It doesn't need to be in front of a screen even anymore. And so we see, again, if we talk about future proofing, I think a lot of schools now, even in Australia, now that they've reopened and we're back to face-to-face instruction, some of them have embraced the fact that during the remote learning period, that the online component was really valuable, and so they've actually retained some of the online learning components, even though they're back to face-to-face teaching. So I think there's a place for all of this. One of the things we see at Google is, obviously people come to Google to search for things, right? It's a search engine. The number of how-to searches, have increased. I think it's 3 times over the last year. So it's people are coming to Google to search for, how do I play the guitar? How do I do this math problem? How do I cook this dish? And it's the same with YouTube. YouTube even more so. If you look at the number of searches that happen on YouTube now, I think there's something like 500 hours of video being uploaded to YouTube every 60 seconds now. So the sheer volume of user-generated content, right, that people are uploading videos onto a platform, and then sharing that. And what's when I talk about two-way interaction, you look at I could read a book. And again, it's one way, right? I'm just consuming the information when I'm reading a book. But when you upload a video, you can, crowdsource and get feedback on, is this the right way I'm playing the guitar? Is this what can I do better, right? So, we see, there's so many ways of looking at, how do you improve using technology? How do you interact, with other learners using technology? And I think we're just on the tip of the iceberg. But as Peter mentioned, the silver lining of COVID has really opened up, all these opportunities for better learning.
Thanks, Swan. I think it goes to that whole point of having really good feedback loops, not only just for our learning, which is often, just in time rather than just in case, but also I think the role of analytics too, right? Which I know Google has got some great tools there, and I think that's where actually when so much of the work is online, we can now get so many different ways of capturing and tracking what's going on and working out not only what works for engagement, but also what is disengaging. And I think that's something that is really interesting in this space. And I know that many people are trying to wrestle with this. How do we continue to engage with our international students, whether they are onshore or offshore? And actually, I want to come to you on that point, Shishi, because that award that you won for the Job Smart Edge program is pretty significant. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit more. What do you think was some of the key defining elements or feedback things that you found out that did so well? And in other words, what are some of the key reasons why you think your program won that award?
Yeah, and it was definitely, as I mentioned, the program itself has been around for 5 years and has been award-winning during those years. But in particular, I think what really stands out is, of course, the program won the award essentially after the first pilot, if that makes sense, because of course we pivoted to come into semester 2 2020, and then to be acknowledged only months later is sort of kudos all round. And I think the fact that the business school, and we know working with universities, change takes time working with universities, but the fact that they pivoted so quickly to respond to the market and really to support students during that time to face an uncertain job market was really standout, and kudos to the business school for putting strategic direction towards changing a program which largely could have been left untouched, because the reputation was strong. We know that at the business school, but that they really wanted to amp up and brought Practera in to really support that, one, via technology, but two, via some of our bread and butter work, which is actually these digital industry projects. And that got dropped into the program. And that was last September. We had 612 students, about 40% of which the data shows us the students were offshore. And to your point, Hamish, around, the role of technology, the role of analytics, the role of engagement and disengagement, feedback loops, like that all comes into play for us, and the why behind the Practera platform, what's at the heartbeat of our platform. And so I think with all of that and getting good results out of that was really critical to that award win and beating a very obviously stellar field in the process.
Thanks so much, Shishi. So obviously providing a range of new features and also making sure you leveraged what you had, and particularly understanding actually who both your stakeholders are and your investors, and who your client and who the sort of clients at the other end are too, is one that you can use that data to create something much richer. Perhaps, Peter, if I could come back to you, because obviously this whole idea of starting to make this space richer, and this is something that you did mention in your opening remarks about this trade investment scheme that New South Wales has now created, which does pick up then on Swan's point of how do we start to future-proof. So I wonder if you could comment there about so how does this sector begin to future-proof? And then specifically whether you might be able to comment on a question that we got sent in prior to the event, which is then what might this mean to then the future of providers such as those in the ELICOS space? So are there ways that people can navigate this new territory, even if it is in the short term, or maybe actually start to breed out a new form of business. Are you able to pick up on some of that work, or what you're seeing happening in terms of the grants that are coming through your way, Peter?
Yeah, I will, Hamish, and if I forget to, please remind me just to put up the link to those grants, because I think these were specifically directed towards many of the businesses that would be on the call today. Look, I think to answer your first question, I mean, like any business, it's about having that balance and having that risk analysis, you know, that's been done so that you've got a variety of different delivery modes, delivery models, partnership models. And I think, you know, we've probably become a little bit, lazy is probably the wrong word, but I think, you know, we had a sector that was growing just astronomically for sort of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. And, you know, I don't think anyone foresaw well, certainly didn't see, apart from Bill Gates, didn't foresee a pandemic, let alone the impact it was going to have on us. And I just think, you know, we were all blindsided by that. So I think it would be remiss if we don't, together collectively, both, you know, collectively, but also as, you know, the individual business owners out there, look to try and future-proof through a wide variety of models. So I think the one that definitely, and Swan's touched on this in his presentation, the one that I think we're definitely, you know, have got so much opportunity to do here in New South Wales, particularly those businesses based in the Sydney region, is, you know, reaching out and finding the partnerships with the Practiras, you know, either at the Practira end or the Google end. You know, there's so many amazing businesses. And, you know, I was going to say startups, but in fact, we're not just talking about startups here. We're talking about businesses that have been established and have got, you know, a model that's been tried and tested for several years now. And we do have some formal programs through the Startup Hub. I mentioned Haymarket HQ, and also even through EduTech at the national level. You know, there's some great opportunities. There's events that we're running all the time, whether they be physical now that they're starting to happen again, or events like this, where we are trying through Study New South Wales to do some of that business matching, not with an international business, but with a local business, because I think our education providers have got such amazing content and such amazing educational quality. And then, you know, we've got technology partners who've got sort of delivery platforms, and those two things combined are really an amazing combination. I just don't think we've really, I don't think our education sector has fully explored that. And, you know, you talk about ELICOS, you know, even if borders open tomorrow, there is going to be that lag in terms of that pipeline. So I do, you know, my heart goes out to those ELICOS providers who I know from this week are going to be severely impacted with the closure of JobKeeper. And, you know, I think many of them have found ways of delivering content online. And if there's a way that we can try and draw those, you know, broader connections with technology businesses that can help the survival of those businesses and help build that bridge to the other side where we do have students coming back on shore, then, you know, we really are trying to find ways to be able to do that. But, you know, the other element I touched on in my opening remarks is that offshore delivery. And as I said before, my time in the region, you know, particularly countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, you know, Cambodia, even Thailand, you know, there is a massive gap between the capacity to be able to pay, to be able to afford, versus the expectation and viability of Australian providers to be able to deliver in market. But I think the secret ingredient there is tapping into a local, you know, large business entity who is the organisation that can fund and can make those kinds of delivery patterns in market viable for both sides, you know, because they are the ones that have the skills gaps in their sectors. Those skills gaps are going to be increasing. The example I used in the healthcare sector is just one, but, you know, you look at the ageing population need, healthcare needs, hospitality and tourism, when that starts to come back, massive gaps in countries like that. And, you know, their local providers are struggling to be able to deliver and meet that need. Our providers here, particularly in the vet sector, are very well regarded, but we do need to find, or the onus, I should say, is on our providers to be able to find those corporate partners in market who can subsidise the cost of delivering those programs. And I think that Sime Darby one is a really perfect example of where those three ingredients coming together nicely.
Thanks very much, Peter. Look, again, a really great series of examples and particularly understanding the current landscape. And I think it also goes to that point of certainly from our perspective as well, seeing particularly countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, where there's a huge opportunity where access to and enriching the space of education is growing, and they are markets that are growing relatively quickly in many ways. And there is almost a sense of coming a little bit, I think, to what you were saying is it's not just about student delivery, but it's almost train the trainer delivery. There are potentially other offshore market opportunities here. And I think it's about, I imagine for many of the businesses joining the webinar today and viewing is about, so how do we start to engage and connect to those people differently? So Swan, do you mind if I come back to you on this point? Because obviously through your experiences at Google, you're often looking at how businesses can drive traffic back to their site, but also increase engagement. I wonder if you could give us maybe a couple of examples or a couple of even any good case studies of where people have been able to do this, who are working at a much smaller level of terms of business size and using the online traffic and sort of different ways to engage online.
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, you're spot on. And earlier you talked about analytics, and web analytics is one component, right? So knowing who's coming to your website, is so important. And what are they doing when they're on your website? So making sure that and there are all these web analytics tools out there now that can actually show you, in terms of a heat map of your website, where are the eyeballs focused on, when they're looking on your site. And making sure that you have, again, interesting content that engages the audience, and so that they spend as much time on your site as possible. So when it comes to analytics, I think that's the key, getting that set up so that exactly visitors that come to your site, what they're doing, how long they're spending on there, where do they click when they click on a specific link, where do they go on a specific site. So there are all these tools that can help businesses and education providers understand better about where their traffic's coming from, whether it's international traffic or domestic traffic, and then when they arrive on your site, what they are doing when they are on your site. So I think that's one very important thing to have set up. And then again, mentioned earlier the content, right? The engaging content that you have on your site. What's going to keep them there? What's going to keep them engaged? I think is so important as well. So yeah, I mean, there's the technology is there. There are tools available, that can help businesses of all sorts, to really better engage with their audience. And again, knowing where they're coming from is step one. And then when they arrive, what are they doing on your site, and how do you better engage and interact with your audience is the second step.
Thanks, Swan. Again, really good to be able to know and have the right tools. Again, very hard to understand something if you can't really measure it in a tangible way. And perhaps just looking at maybe what we can measure, I wonder if I can then jump to you, Shishi, just about whether Practera has any projects that have specifically picked up on or tried to design for international students. And then again, whether you can comment on how Practera might be seeing whether they've got any ambitions to expand their work into Asia or into different markets.
Yeah, we definitely, and really depends on sort of the customers we work with. We're really the platform that helps drive our customers' success and what they wish to deploy. And we often work with partners and universities and education providers in a collaborative way to do that. And what we've done, as an example of perhaps where we've designed specifically, and I think this might be a good example to bring to this scenario, is working with the University of Melbourne, where what they did was use our platform to facilitate a welcome to experience. So inbound, incoming international students coming into, at that time, physically coming into Melbourne, as international students into the University of Melbourne, going through a cultural and a city and social and then educational welcome to experience, and then matched with domestic students to complete one of our digital industry project experiences. So what can be done on the platform is far and wide when it comes to servicing the international market. And as I said, it's not exclusive. We're not exclusive to, but of course, the space of employability and the space of soft skills development and the space of industry connection is very pertinent to the international student market. And we know that students want, as they are studying either in their formal study load or around their formal study load, they want real industry experience with real companies, and they want real feedback with real industry mentors. So you know, that extends beyond, of course, international students, but we know that international students, that's part of their value add coming into, and their destination choice, are looking for those options. Sorry, Hamish, I've forgotten the second part of your question. Please remind me.
Just whether, has Criteria got any plans or ambitions to expand into Asia?
Yeah, thank you so much for the prompt. Look, and I just want to sort of bring to the conversation, you know, I've spoken of some examples, but at the end of the day, we are a Sydney-based startup and now SME in many ways. So we have grown over a number of years now, starting off as a Sydney headquartered, but now quite an international company now that we're all sort of COVID and working from home, and we've been able to engage actually our Asian counterparts, for example, where Central was at one stage, and we are 10 years old as a business, but where Sydney and Australia was at one stage the locus of our activity. That's no longer as relevant anymore. And our own workforce, we're about 45, 50 odd individuals spread across actually 8 countries, has given us a bit of scope to do that. Now, in terms of directly sort of entering into Asia, we have done a little bit of that in the past, but as a small business, as you can understand, where we deploy our resources and where we strategically head is a significant consideration for us in terms of future growth. Now, in recent years, we have sort of about 3 years ago started our market entry into the US, and then as a result of staff and COVID and the situation, have had staff based elsewhere. But in terms of explicitly into Asia, it actually has been discussed in terms of sort of growth pillars for us. And as a business, when it comes to, as I said, shoring up our business growth, we are in the current times obviously responding both in a reactive and a proactive way, and then also in a proactive way, then looking at what are the growth engines for us as a business. And Asia and development into Asia is an option for us. We haven't explicitly done that, but it is an option for us. And in the first instance, where we can, supporting the likes of, say, the example I provided earlier, working with the Education Centre of Australia to sort of power them to reach into Asia market. But for us explicitly, it's then about, okay, well, what staff do we have in Asia? Because a lot of that business development is, and some of you on the call might know, is very much relationship based and being on the ground. And whilst we have engineers and coders in Asia, we don't necessarily have our business development staff and delivery staff on the ground in Asia at the moment. Not that we, not to rule that out, but at the moment that's not where we are, but very much a consideration as we consider to shore up our own business trajectory growth as a startup and SME.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Shishi. Really great to hear. It's such an exciting story of both your expansion. And I really like the way how you talked about it's almost not being centered on Sydney as much. It's actually you're sort of now expanded across the globe. And I think perhaps one of the things that I'm picking up from all three of you here is the role of partnerships. Now, as different from necessarily saying that we've got a stakeholder who's investing in us or they're essentially seen as a client, there was a question sent in about the idea of how are partnership models starting to emerge between industry and particularly in this context, higher education, either in examples that any of you have seen, or what we're actually beginning to see happening in other countries, such as across Asia, where higher education and industry are finding much closer connections and partnerships. And this is often what we see happen really challenging times, people actually start to cluster together and say, we need each other. We can actually consolidate and develop something even better. So just in terms of a question to our panelists, and if you've got a really great example or something that you've seen of a good partnership, perhaps give us a wave with your hand and I'll defer to you, because I think that's something that people are beginning to see. How do we change the nature of partnerships? Peter, if I come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Hamish. And what I was going to say was, with this expansion of our international network, what we're finding is, and with this kind of renewed, sophisticated understanding of the importance of the international ed sector, and where international ed, I guess, sits at the heart of our trade and investment strategy for the state, for the reasons that I talked about before, we've got a great opportunity here, I think, now through some of the big investment opportunities that the state's putting out there. There's a new incentive program that's going to be part of this Investment New South Wales program called the Jobs Plus program. You know, we have people through this offshore network trying to attract businesses to come and set up here. I think there's a great opportunity for us to be able to work with providers to connect them in with those businesses that are thinking about making those decisions, because they'll also have operations on the ground in those countries where those skills gaps are evident. And so I think, you know, we've got a chance here to be able to sort of bring together, I should say, those kind of commercial partnerships between our education institutions and those businesses offshore that are making investment decisions right now, because that might actually be the icing on the cake in a sense for some of those businesses who you know can also see potential to be able to partner with those institutions here in Australia to support because you know one of the first things that companies, and this is not an area that I work on actively myself, but our investment colleagues tell us one of the first things that businesses, and Swan can probably support this through Google's decisions around investing here, but the primary thing that businesses focus on is whether they're going to have access to the right skilled labour force, people with the right skill sets to be able to make that investment successful. So, you know, I think we as an education sector haven't really tapped into that enough, and I think there's been a lot of focus on partnering with other education institutions offshore rather than corporations, businesses who I think, as I said, have got the financial wherewithal to be able to fund the delivery of some of these programs in market.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. Just Swan, did you have any comment to make just on that about the role of partnerships?
Yeah, so you know, Peter talked about the partnerships between universities, you know, locally and internationally. I think from a technology standpoint, we've definitely seen more universities outsource or find partnerships outside of their space. So one example is Monash University, who we're working with at the moment on learning analytics, right? So one area that we do a lot of work in is around research and data crunching, right? And so providing the platform by which you can measure how often are students interacting, how often are they collaborating, how often are they engaging on an online platform, right? Gives you a whole wealth of information around, and then if you can sort of align that with their learning progress as well. So it gives you a whole wealth of information that universities will find really valuable. And so, that was something that Monash University didn't necessarily have all of the expertise in-house. And so they looked, outside of their area rather than, again, spin up a internal project where they had to build in-house, which would just take a lot of manpower and a lot of resources. They said, all right, why don't we find the experts who do this well? And so, we've been working with them and collaborating with them on understanding what they're trying to look for and building sort of that bespoke model that, will fit what they're trying to accomplish, right? So they can then feed that data back into their learning platform to provide, again, a much better experience for students. So we're seeing this, partnerships that universities are taking, increase, as a result of COVID as more universities are forced to look at online learning and virtual learning and all the different modes of instruction and interaction with students. And many of them are looking for external experts who can provide, whether it's a niche offering or a building a bespoke application or a a critical integration with existing legacy infrastructure. So we see a lot of them starting to look outside, look to the industry, look at the experts who know how to build this stuff and have experience building this kind of stuff for enterprises, for companies for many years now, right? How do we take some of that expertise into the education sector? So from a partnership standpoint, it's definitely increased over the last couple of years in the area of partnerships with industry from a technology standpoint.
Yeah, great. Good to hear. Great context and good example of how even the big movers start to do something differently. Shisha, I'm sure you've got a whole array of really great partnerships you know of. Have you got some favourite ones that you've seen happen?
Oh, favourites. Oh, that's a big question on favourites. I might actually talk to something that is a recent initiative that I've been quite involved with in terms of my role at Practerra. And this was quite innovative, and hence why I'm going to sort of label it as a favourite. So, and this, I guess, as a small business for us, allowed us to create new partnerships with our sector. So when COVID first hit, a lot of our core customer base are education providers, universities, etc. And when COVID first hit last March, and the reality sunk in that we needed to, a lot of the university providers needed to pivot to online delivery. They obviously then looked for a platform solution to do that. And at that time, we, being a technology company, sat sort of prime and square as a possible solution in the mix. And we knew that our core customer base would be heavily impacted financially. And that was starting to show quite early on. So we started to heavily discount and just be a solution at the time, even as a SME and small business, particularly discounting our BAU work, which is generally helping our customers design and configure bespoke programs onto our platform or our programs business, and we're heavily discounted. This was kind of last March, April, May, and then what we then did was turn that into an experiential learning innovation grants program, whereby we actually invited submissions from the sector to then come on board and effectively partner with us and use our platform and pilot our platform over this COVID period and where that extends to then onto a commercial partnership and relationship. Since then, we've run 3 rounds of this experiential learning innovation grant, eLeague, that has created new partnerships for us and created new ways of doing things and diversified a little bit our customer base as well, which I know, Hamish, you and I have been talking about. And what that has meant over the past about 12 months is we've committed about $1 million to the sector in terms of this grants program, which we've then gone on to showcase in various education conferences and talked about that as an example of something a little bit different. And so when our co-founder sort of came up with the idea, it was like, what? We as a small business could do something a little bit different. Like that was just not something that was immediately evident to me per se. But then that's become a bit of a established mechanism for us, but also as a solution to the sector and as a support to the sector and to give back somewhat during this time. And it doesn't mean that for us as a business, it's been all easy going, of course. When our customers are impacted, we are too, as a small business, like many on the call. But we made that commitment to help during these times, and being at a technology platform, we were prime positioned. So that's sort of one example. I might just quickly add that, Hamish, as well, of what Swan said just now. Another area of partnership that's become increasingly pertinent, and we have partnered in this space as well, is, of course, as we internationalise and engage in student data more broadly, of course, the role of data security and privacy and all of that really comes to the forefront. And so what we've done is and it's a big project for us through some of the work led by one of my colleagues, is really partnering with Data 61 and UniSA around a really big project around security, privacy, and really upping the stance from our point of view. And one of my colleagues leads that big area of work for us.
Fantastic, Shishi. Really good to hear. I think that's exactly actually what I'm sure many of our attendees also want to hear, is how do you start to just change some ways of experimenting and almost inviting the outside in as part of that experiment and learning together. And that sort of alludes to what Swan picked up on as well. Now, I know we're sort of almost out of time, but I did sort of also just want to, just for a moment, pick up on an open response here from the panel about the other end, so which is about our international students. And I know that obviously at the outset of this event, Peter, you talked about those 60,000 students who are still here and the challenges that they have been through. It's often made headline news. And as we're beginning, I guess, as to return, not to normal, but we're definitely returning from what I hear from many about a sort of a much more balanced, blended approach. What is some of your advice? If you, could talk to some of those international students, and what do you think are some of the opportunities they might now have in this perhaps slightly new, uncharted territory that as things begin to restabilise, maybe some new opportunities are opening up. Would any of you like to comment on perhaps what we see happening for international students themselves, and maybe some of your advice or blended approaches that you could recommend for them? Anyone like to jump in there?
Yeah, I can just kick off. I mean, look, I think my message is really just to sort of keep the faith. I mean, I really am confident we're going to get progress soon. And, if students, if you were a student who, was here originally, went home, got stuck, couldn't get back, and want to come back, particularly those students that might be, say, studying high degree research where they need to be here to do that lab work, just to keep the faith, because we are going to get there. I definitely feel that the tide is turning. We're certainly getting really close here in New South Wales. And I think that, once we signal that there is an opportunity for students to return, hopefully that will give those students, the faith that they can stay the course if their choice is to return here on shore. To those students who are thinking about studying in Australia, I think having the faith to start online and knowing that you're going to be getting an amazing quality product, so to speak, by starting online and perhaps doing a significant part of your studies online, just given the quality of how our education institutions have adapted. And if part of your plan is to have an opportunity to come here on shore, just to be confident that is going to happen, that we are going to get there. So I think that's probably the key messages from my side, Hamish.
Thanks, Peter. Any advice from yourself, Swan, on this?
Yeah, I echo what Peter said. I think keep the faith. We're getting there. It's just around the corner. But I challenge you to use the time to upskill yourselves, right? Because what we call the new normal, is an opportunity for you as a student to pick up new skills, right? To challenge your education provider to give you more, to provide for more. One lesson I've always learned in life is you always ask for more, right? Because so you never know what you're going to get. And then for the education providers, likewise, I think the challenge now, with this new normal is how are you going to provide a better value add, to a returning international student, that has had, the last 12 months of 12 to 18 months of challenge by the time we're through all of this stuff, right? So how are you going to provide better environment for them to learn in, for them to see the same value, that they're paying for? And so I think that's the challenge that you have. And, we talked a bit about this earlier in the session around future proofing, around redesigning, around hybrid learning models, around data analytics. So there are many different things to consider. And I think this is a good time and sort of that tipping point that we're getting past once we open the floodgates again. But, I think the challenge is going to be, even higher.
Thanks, Swan. Shishi, what do you hear from the end users? What's been the most powerful thing for them?
Yeah, I think, and I'm glad we're sort of tailing off on this point, is that, what we've seen is, immediately when education providers needed a solution, like we needed to go online, there was no argument about it. But what we're starting to see now is that students are getting a little bit of that online fatigue, and, how do we make sure that our models continue to I think, how do we ensure that we're continuing to listen to students as well in that process? And of course, the education providers need to do that themselves, and that impacts, of course, then on what we do. I think my other encouragement, and Peter and Swan said that, around the hang in there, is that, this is a real, I guess what the students are going through in terms of this really challenging environment is reflected in the broader sort of VUCA world that we're in, and that, this is a time for students to adapt, build resilience, coping mechanisms, because that's really real in the workforce as well. Even just the simple point around online fatigue, that's playing out in the workforce as well. So I think, this is with those lens, hopefully a piece of encouragement for the students out there, that, and I don't want to underplay what they're experiencing during this very critical time around their studies and what that means for sort of the bigger career picture. But, looking at it from a perspective that perhaps supports them in terms of coming out into this very real world.
Yeah, well said, Shishi. I'm glad you mentioned that word VUCA. It's like, I think I heard VUCA about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I didn't really understand it at the time. I think we all really understand VUCA now, because that really has been the experience for many people over this period. And it's not over. And in fact, it's not over, not just for some of us here in Australia and those international students who are still doing their best to stay engaged and the providers looking to meet them, but we still know that many of our neighbours across Asia Pacific are still facing some of these struggles. So the challenges are not over, and I think it's still leaving space for innovation to strike. And I want to pick up then on some of the themes that we've talked about today, which is about looking at how we start to navigate some new tools and models, how we look to engage differently, but also tap into where we're engaging well, and when, picking up on your last point there, Shishi, about where we're beginning to disengage, where people are starting to feel that fatigue, and how do we start to change before we get caught out again. But also the opportunity to start to look at both credentials and certification differently too. There's a lot more richness and offering opening up. And I also want to acknowledge the comments that Peter has been making about the opportunities and the grants and the networks that are being supported by government, both at state and federal level, to really start to make it more accessible to both the students and the providers to really build new business opportunities and network opportunities. And I think it's actually the networks that is probably most important here. Being able to build those new networks, being able to start to tap into them, either if you're a student with industry, and if you're a higher education provider, how do we tap into industry ourselves, or other ideas? We don't have to solve this by ourselves. And so building up good shared networks is important. So this has been a really interesting discussion on how we start to tap into international education as part of this Asia Business Series. As part of our final closeout today's event, I want to firstly thank our wonderful partner, the City of Sydney, in supporting this series and the rest of this series that are to come, but also to our incredible speakers that have shared their time today, particularly opening our proceedings today, Councillor Robert Cock from the City of Sydney, who remarked about the opportunity for particularly our communities here at home and what it means to engage differently, to Peter Mackey from Education Trade for New South Wales Treasury for his great remarks on the opportunities, Swan Yo from Australia New Zealand for Google, on all the types of both tech and networks and ways we can tap into different future-proofing approaches. And of course, to Shishi Trong, I always love your passion and energy, Shishi, particularly from the work you're doing at New South Wales Practitioner. It's just really fantastic to see the strengths that you're building and the networks that you're building. And so this whole this Asia Business Event series has been part of the City of Sydney Knowledge Exchange Grant Program. And registrations are going to be open very soon for the second event, which is going to be focused on capitalising on e-commerce opportunities in Southeast Asia. And this is looking to be held on Tuesday, the 20th of April from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So you can always find out more about that event by visiting Asialink Business, asialinkbusiness.com.au. And finally, for our wonderful array of participants that have joined us today, we would love you to follow up and give us some feedback on today's event. So please either complete that when you finish today, or complete the survey that will be coming to you at the close of this event. So again, thank you to everyone for participating, and particularly to our speakers for contributing such energy and expertise today. We thank you for your attendance in this program. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Hamish. Thanks, everyone.